Recording is in progress. Right, so yeah, we're going to chat about hay meadows. So someone else has arrived. So we're going to sort of, first of all, what are they? Why they're important, threats to them. Then the main part of the evening is going to be sort of looking at some pretty pictures of hay meadow flowers and a bit of sort of ID on them. But obviously that's easier to do when you're out in the field. But and then there'll be a bit on how to manage your hay meadow. If you're lucky enough to have a hay meadow, how to create one. Even if you've just got a small bit of lawn, you can create your own mini hay meadow. And then it's a bit about how we can get out and enjoy them in the next few months when they all hit their prime. If anyone's got any questions, then just stick it in the chat and I shall check that every once in a while and hopefully answer any queries you've got. So here we go. So what is a hay meadow? It's a permanent grassland where the vegetation is cut as a crop to provide overwinter food for livestock. That's a nice picture of New Grove Meadows. They're one of our reserves up near Trellick, which I was at last week. It doesn't look like that at the moment. That's how it looks in June, full of all sorts. At the moment, the grass is a lot shorter, but there's literally thousands of green-winged orchids there at the moment and thousands of cowslips. So it's not at its prime at the moment, but it's still well worth a visit. So hay meadows traditionally cut in sort of July or August. That allows the flowers to flourish, provide nectar and everything for the insects, and also crucially for them to set seed so they can continue into the next year. There's no need for insecticides, herbicides, and fertilizer use kept to a minimum. And historically, probably all farms would have had a hay meadow. They've been an integral part of the farm. But sadly, during World War II, 2.5 million hectares of permanent grassland were lost for growing cereals. Obviously, there was a real demand for producing food at home, so there was a real necessity for it. So that happened, but obviously we lost a lot of our valuable grasslands then. And then this continued. In the 1960s, there was a change to earlier cuts for silage, which didn't allow the flowers to set seed, or the invertebrate communities that sort of rely on the hay meadow to thrive. And a lot of these silage fields were also reseeded with ryegrass and white clover put in, lots of fertilization to produce faster growing crops with bigger yields. So it was all about sort of intensification, really, and that isn't good for the hay meadow. So why are they so important? Very rich floral diversity. Some of the fields in Gwent, which I've surveyed, have up to 80 species of grass and flowers. And because you could look at it that just any flower will do, really, but in terms of pollination, but there's lots of different moths that will only feed on one particular type of plant. So if you lose that one plant from your hay meadow, you're going to lose that species of insect as well. For instance, like there's a bird's foot trefoil, which is quite common in the hay meadows. The burnet moth, which you can see, 6-spot burnet moth there, the black one with red dots on it. That's what their caterpillars feed on. So the butterfly, the moths and butterflies, bees will probably get nectar from lots of different flowers, but the caterpillars rely on very specific species. We need this diversity. And I said they're full of bees, beetles, grasshoppers, butterflies. And if you've got lots of insects, and obviously you've got lots of other animals, small mammals, birds that prey on them. And in the UK, there's more priority species for conservation associated with grassland than any other type. So as well as being great for biodiversity, they also support pollinating insects. If we don't, I'm sure you've heard, if bees disappeared, we'd disappear soon after them, because we need insects to pollinate all our crops. And the hay meadows are full of insects, which will obviously spread out from there and pollinate lots of crops as well. Help mitigate flooding by holding onto rainwater, capture vast amounts of carbon. Oh, someone else just appearing. There we go. 11 tons of CO2 per hectare. And also a hay meadow, it just raises the spirit. It's good for your mental well-being. If you can go out and have a wander around a hay meadow in June, I think you're going to feel better about yourself. So what threats are they under? So I said there've been a lot lost. 97% of species-rich neutral grassland has been lost in the UK between 1930 and 1984, and these losses are still ongoing. That's 3 million hectares, which is I don't know what that equates to. Everyone always equates it to football pitches or to Wales. I don't know what that equates to doing that, but it's a huge amount to lose. Just a tiny 3% fraction of it left. And there's many reasons why they've gone. As development, building of roads, housing, which obviously we probably all live in a house and we've all probably traveled on a road today. So we can't say there shouldn't be roads, there shouldn't be housing, but it's making sure that these developments now are put in the right place, because there's not much sort of valuable species-rich grassland left. So to lose any would be dreadful. And then there's agricultural improvement, drainage, ploughing, reseeding, use of fertilizers, herbicides, slurry application, conversion to arable, changing from haymaking to silage production. All this intensification can lead to the loss of our hay meadows. But I have to say, obviously, that might seem a bit critical of farmers. Obviously, they're just trying to produce the food that we eat. So again, we need food to eat, as we need roads and housing. But it's trying to do it in a sympathetic way, really, and that's down to us as well. If we paid for food that's being produced in a more sustainable, environmental friendly way, then the farmers be more inclined to produce it. So we can all sort of vote for that with our money, but I realise it probably costs more. There's lots of arguments, but change from haymaking to grazing, inappropriate levels of grazing, typically too intensive. Also, there can be a lack of if there's a lack of an annual cut, and if you don't remove the cuttings from a hay meadow, then quickly coarser grasses come in, the area scrubs over, and you've lost your hay meadow. You can cut too early, which doesn't allow the flowers to set seed. As I said, there's abandonment and neglect as well. Quickly bracken can come in from the edges. And also, there's obviously lots of talk about tree planting in a moment, which is important and great. But again, it's tree planting in the right place, the right tree in the right place. You don't want to have a lovely species-rich grassland and then stick a load of trees over the top. There's plenty of other fields with nowhere near as much value, which the tree planting could go in. So Gwent Hay Meadows are typically onto the neutral soils, but down in the south of Gwent, we do have some on sort of more calcareous soils, and they get a different range of species there. And they said it's a huge range and diversity. And if you've got little wet flushes in your hay meadow as well, then the diversity is even greater. So now we're going to look at, I'll just check if there's any questions. I can't even see if there's questions now. I need an assistant, really. Bear with me. So if we're looking at grasslands, obviously the first thing you probably need to look at is the grass. And generally in a really nice hay meadow, it will be full of sort of finer sort of grass species that allow the wildflowers to get up and past the grass. Something in the chat there. Wood pasture. So yes, wood pasture, that's a sort of a different kind of habitat. That's different to hay meadows. So if we're talking about, someone's asked about wood pasture. So there's pastures generally sort of grazed. So a hay meadow is generally, it's shut off and isn't grazed until after the hay cut's been taken. Wood pastures generally where can be species rich grassland, but there'll be really low intensity grazing, and but trees dotted throughout. So the trees aren't casting too much shade, so the wildflowers still do well, but you can still have your grazing animals in there. So that's kind of a different habitat, but another valuable habitat. So if we're looking at the species in a grassland, the first thing to look at is the grass. So it's a nice fine grass species. On the left here is a sweet vernal grass. So this is quite often in a really nice sort of hay meadow, could be the commonest species there. And it's probably one of the few species that'll be flowering this time of year, as vernal implies. It's a spring grass, and it has a chemical in it, which I think is called coumarin, which is what gives freshly cut hay its distinctive scent. So sweet vernal grass, only a small little grass, and there we go, somebody else coming along, and it allows all the wildflowers to get up amongst it. And then on the right here is crested dog's tail. So that's a really tough, wiry grass, but again, really sort of slender. lets the wildflowers come up. But quite often, if your field was grazed, you might find a lot of the other grass gets grazed off, but the crested dog's tail is left. It's really tough, wiry grass. And then we've got another selection of fine grasses here. On the left, we have red fescue, which you can see it looks a bit red. It's probably more pinky than anything, but there wasn't a word for pink until a few hundred years ago. So lots of our flora, when it's actually pink, is called red. So this is red fescue, which you can see the pinkiness there, and its sort of flowers. And it has really, really fine leaves. So again, it allows all the wildflowers to come up. And then on the right-hand side, that is my favorite species of grass, which is a quaking grass, a really delicate, pretty grass. A lot of people have quaking grass in their gardens as an ornamental, but that's generally the greater quaking grass, which has bigger flower heads on it. That's a really, really nice grass. And I've yet to find a field that's got quaking grass in it that doesn't have ton of other great stuff. So if you find quaking grass, there's certain species which are really good sort of indicators of quality, and quaking grass is one such species. And then we've got a few more grass species here. On the left, we have rough stalk meadow grass, which, as its name would apply, sort of appears in meadows. It's probably in virtually every meadow there is in Gwent. Generally appears slightly more around the edges, but just here I've stolen this from a lady called Rosemary Etheridge. I hope she doesn't mind, but this little picture here, because a really good way to identify very similar grass species is the ligule. So it's where the leaf joins the stem. There's this really fine see-through little I'm going to say filament, but that's not the right word, just sticking up, and that's called the ligule. And quite often similar species have different shaped ligule. So you can see on the left there, the rough stalk meadow grass has a really long pointed ligule, and the smooth meadow grass has a tiny little ligule. And there's another more people, and there's other similar species. There's creeping bent and common bent, which again both are feathery grasses, quite distinctive. They're one of the latter ones to flower, but again, quite difficult to tell apart, but they have different size ligules. So the common bent has a big ligule, and on the creeping bent, a tiny little ligule. So next time you're out looking at grasses, look a bit more closely, just bend back the leaf a bit and look for this little filament thing. That's the ligule, and that can help you identify that thing. And on the right here, again, a very common grass of our meadows, which is Yorkshire fog. So generally in the very, very best meadows, there'll always be a bit of Yorkshire fog, but not so much. But other meadows that are not quite so good, but still pretty good, have lots of Yorkshire fog in. And it gets its name because when it's all up in flower, and you sort of look low across the meadow, it's almost like there's a little fog of all these grasses sticking up. And that's when it's fresh, it's got this distinct sort of pinky, and then it goes a bit more grey, and maybe looks a bit more fog-like. And if you look down the bottom of that, people say it has pink striped pajamas. So right down near the base of the stem, if you have a look, it's got these little pink striped pajamas on it. And there's a very similar species called creeping soft grass, which doesn't tend to get this pinkiness, doesn't tend to have the pink striped pajamas. But if you look at where there's bends in the stem, the nodes on the creeping soft grass have very hairy, so its other name is hairy knees. So that's how to tell Yorkshire fog and the creeping soft grass apart. There's two other quite similar grasses here. On the left, we have Timothy, which I think is a great name for a grass. And then on the right, we have meadow foxtail. So again, they look quite similar, but generally the meadow foxtail on the right is very early flowering. If you go out for a walk now, you'll probably see meadow foxtail. And the little anthers there start off kind of purple. They quickly go sort of a russet orange, and that's where it gets its name. So it looks like a bushy fox's tail just when the grass starts to go over a bit. And then and on the left, the Timothy, it's generally a longer thing. They're both sort of like microphones, sort of microphones you might use in TV recording, big long boom. Are they boom microphones? I don't know. But the way to tell them apart from Timothy generally being longer and flowering quite a bit later, is if you bend back and you look at the gloom. There's lots of different terms with grasses. There's the gloom on the Timothy has 2 horns on it, which look like devil's horns. So if you just get it and you kind of bend it over, they'll all stick up and you can see all these 2 little devil's horns. So that's Timothy. And then on the meadow foxtail, there's only 1 horn, so it doesn't look like devil's horns. There we go. And then you probably won't see so much of these grasses in a good hay meadow, but I did say if grass isn't cut so often, it can become a bit rank. So generally, if your meadow is becoming a bit rank, it isn't cut every year or cut very late, or perhaps even if when you cut it, if you don't take away your cuttings, it'll start to come rank, and then you get in species such as false oak grass and cocksfoot. So it's cocksfoot there on the right, and when it fully opens like that, it kind of looks like the foot of a chicken, I suppose, with the claws sort of spraying out. And these are generally sort of big, tall, clumpy grasses, and if you have too many of them, they kind of swamp out all your flowers. So that's why a hay meadow thrives, because it's cut every year. All the hay is took away, and it keeps these sort of bigger thug grasses out the way. But generally, you'll find little bits of false oak grass and cocksfoot even in your nicest meadow. And as well as the grasses, there's very closely related species. You got sedges. So here on the left is spring sedge. There's a few sedges you'll get in your hay meadows, but a spring sedge, which is, again, if you go to New Grove Meadows, as well as the green-winged orchids and the cowslips, which are splendid at the moment, there's loads of this spring sedge, just a tiny little plant. And generally when the hay meadow gets up and tall in June or July, you probably won't even notice the spring sedge, but it's a real good indicator of a quality grassland, tiny little thing. And on the right is a field woodrush. Various woodrush species, but you can tell a woodrush because it has these distinctive white hairs on it, sort of at the top of the stem there. So there's various woodrushes you get in woodlands, as the name would apply, but this field woodrush you get in the fields, and also called Good Friday grass. It's an early species, so it tends to be at its best around Good Friday, although Easter alters every year, so I don't know how the grass knows to be at its best on that day, but there we go. And also called sweep's brush, because it looks a bit like a chimney sweep's brush. And you may be glad to know that's the end of the grasses and the like, but we do have, I'll give you more details later, but we do have a course looking specifically at grasses, sedges and rushes at our Springdale Farm Reserve in June. So if anybody fancies the torture of trying to learn their grasses, sedges and rushes, then please book on and join me on the day. That would be great. So now we're going to look at some of the flowers of our hay meadows. We'll start with some of the early ones. We've got on the left here, we've got cuckoo flower, also known as milkmaids, and various other things. Lady smock as well. Apparently it's got 31 different names, and there's probably more. Sort of called cuckoo flower because it early flowering, and generally when we had a lot more cuckoos about, cuckoos would be calling just as the cuckoo flower came into bloom. And on the right we've got a cowslip, relative of the primrose, primula, and that's looking, there's just thousands of these at New Grove at the moment. And I was at our Pentwyn Farm Reserve a couple of weeks ago, and one of the fields there was absolutely sort of yellow with them, kind of thing, looking amazing. And then we've got here on the left ribwort plantain, a really common species of most grasslands. Probably have that in your lawn as well, but you can have a game of conkers with that, or You can sort of slide your fingers along, and the end bit shoots off the end into someone's face. I was doing a guided walk a few years ago, which had some small children on, and I was demonstrating that to a small child, and I flicked it into his face, and he burst into tears. His parents stood there, which was a great moment for me. And then on the right we have a sorrel. So that's one of the dock family, and you do get bigger thugs in the grass than like broadleaf dock, but common sorrel, quite a delicate plant and quite a common component of our hay meadows, and you can eat the leaves of that as sorrel, but apparently you don't eat too many because it's got oxalic acid in the leaves, which too much of that will make you poorly, but a little bit of that is all right. And then we've got a real sort of classic here of the hay meadows, and when these come out and they're stood tall in the hay meadow, look amazing. It's an oxeye daisy. Move that out of the way, and you can see there's a fly there enjoying that, but it's pretty unmistakable. Just like the tiny daisies in your lawn, this is just a huge, big, outsized version, but most hay meadows have them. And then we've got a couple of similar species here. We've got the main picture's lesser stitchwort. So you're probably seeing hedgerows this time of year, greater stitchwort. This is its sort of grassland relative. Generally, you won't see the greater stitchwort in the middle of the field, and you won't see the lesser stitchwort in a hedgerow or in the woodlands. But really well adapted, really sort of thin and wiry. They're sort of getting themselves up and really sort of flimsy stems, but they can almost climb up through the grasses and get their flowers and leaves up to where they need be. So the Latin name for stitchwort is stellaria, which means star. So you can see each little flower is like a little star there. But there's another quite similar species you get in your hay meadow, which is the smaller one down on the left, which is common mouse ear. But generally it's a lot smaller plant, and you can probably see a lot hairier. And if you look at the leaves of that, they're quite stubby little leaves and very hairy, just like a mouse's ear. So whereas the leaves of the lesser stitchwort are really long, pointy needle things. So you can think of stitch and stitching and needles, and that'll help you identify it. But apparently the name's got nothing to do with the leaves being needle-like. It's to do with if you had a stitch, if you eat some stitchwort, it'll cure your stitch, apparently. Haven't tried that. And then we've got, everyone's familiar with a buttercup. There's lots of different buttercup species, but we have three main ones which are in our hay meadows. So we have on the left bulbous buttercup, and in the top right meadow buttercup, and in the bottom right a plant that some people don't like is creeping buttercup. A lot of plants which have creeping in the title can be a bit annoying because they sort of creep along and then reroot, and they can quickly overtake things. So some people maybe don't like that in their garden, but they all look very similar, and they all, if you put them under your chin, they'll all tell you whether you like butter or not, but there's ways to tell them apart. So first of all, generally the first one flowering of the year will be bulbous buttercup, although some creeping in meadow will be flowering now. But by the time you get into June and July, all the bulbous buttercup will have finished flowering, and it'll only be the creeping and meadow left. But the way to tell them apart is out of these three, you can see all the yellow petals there, but underneath the petals you have the sepals. So on creeping and meadow buttercup, the sepals point upwards, and on bulbous buttercup, they point downwards. So that's the way to tell them apart. But then if you want to tell creeping and meadow apart, you can look at the leaves. Creeping has generally sort of more blotchy leaves and sort of thicker leaves, whereas the meadow has these really finely divided leaves. But also you can look at the stem. I hope you're still with me on this. You can look at the stem of the creeping and the meadow buttercup. Hopefully you can see on the creeping buttercup, the stem is ribbed, and on the meadow buttercup, it isn't ribbed. But just to confuse things, the stem on the bulbous buttercup is also ribbed. So just having a ribbed stem doesn't mean it's creeping buttercup. It may be bulbous, but that's when you've got to look at the sepals as well. So ribbed and downturned sepals is bulbous, upturned sepals and a ribbed stem is creeping, and upturned sepals and a smooth stem is meadow. Also, if you happen just to dig down about a centimetre below the ground at the base of a bulbous buttercup, you'll find a bulb, which you won't find with the creeping or meadow buttercup. There we go. If anyone comes on any of our walks later on in the year, I shall be going through buttercup identification in more detail in the field, which makes it oh, somebody else. There we go. Makes it a lot clearer. But generally, when we do our walks in June, all the bulbous buttercup has gone over, so it's a real challenge to find one, but we can generally find one or two. Right, and then we have lots of members of the pea family in our hay meadows. We've got the top left, the yellow one, that's meadow vetchling. That's Lathyrus, which is the Latin name, which if you're into gardening, you probably know that's the sort of scientific name for sweet pea as well. So basically it is just a small sweet pea, which is a lovely little plant, and that sort of does really well in the hay meadows because it's got the little tendrils, just like our sweet peas. We might grow a sweet pea up a cane. So meadow vetchling, all the taller plants in the hay meadow are just like fantastic canes to grow up. So they grow up and they get their leaves up there and their flowers. And then bottom left, we have common vetch. And then on the right hand side, one of my favorites is a tufted vetch. Really beautiful, sort of member of the pea family. Again, that sort of forms sort of big patches. You won't find it, and then also you find a big patch of it, and then there won't be any in another big patch of it. But it really is really pretty. On the walk last year, I showed some tufted vetch to one of the participants, and she became quite emotional at the beauty of it, which was quite nice. And again, so they're all pea families. So all of these, once they finish flowering, they all form little pods. And then more members of the pea family here. This is a bird's foot trefoil, which I mentioned earlier. The caterpillars of the burnet moths and the common blue butterflies love bird's foot trefoil, and obviously all the bees and everything love getting the nectar from it. And you can see in the top right there why it gets its name bird's foot, because that's all the little pea pods there, the little seed pods, and they all sort of form like the toes of a bird's foot. And generally, sort of in your dry hay meadow, it'll be common bird's foot trefoil. But if your hay meadow is a little bit damper, then you quite often you can get the greater bird's foot trefoil as well, which is down in the bottom right hand corner. Another name for that's hairy bird's foot trefoil. It generally is a little bit hairier, generally a bit taller, a bit more sprawling. But also, if you grab one stem of it and you break the stem, if the stem is hollow, it's greater bird's foot trefoil. And if it's a solid stem, then it's your standard bird's foot trefoil. Also called eggs and bacon, and many other words. You can see the yellow bit there being the eggs, and then the sort of redder bits when it hasn't fully opened yet being the bacon. And other members of the same family, you've got more legumes, various clovers. So you've got in the top left red clover, which is pink. As I sort of said earlier, there wasn't a word for pink a few hundred years ago, so it's called red. And then very similar to it in the top right is zigzag clover, which is fairly difficult to tell apart, but it's generally you'll find little plants of red clover dotted everywhere. Generally, when you find zigzag clover, it's an enormous, big, dense patch, probably with no other sort of flowers growing through it. And it's called zigzag because the stems kind of go a little bit zigzaggy, but that can be quite hard to see. And they generally have sort of narrower leaves as well. And generally, if you see an odd-looking red clover, it's probably zigzag clover. Down in the bottom left, you have white clover, which generally, if there's a lot of white clover, that's an indication that there's been quite a lot of improvements happened to the field, so it's generally not as good. But it's a native species, and there'll be small amounts of white clover generally, even in really good sort of hay meadows. And then in the bottom right, there's that little yellow clover there. That's a lesser trefoil. But there's a few different ones. There's like a hop trefoil, and I think a large trefoil, and black medic. They're all small little yellow clovers. And then we have the dandelion type plants. So in the middle, there is a dandelion, which a lot of people don't like, and people pull out of their lawns and try and get rid of. But I think this year, more than any other year, I've seen so many dandelions. There's been fields in April time, we're just absolutely full of dandelions, providing, with hardly any other flowers flowering, providing sort of vital nectar sources for the early bumblebees and the like. And then the other day I was going past some fields, and it almost looked as if there was like a mist hanging over the field. There was so much of the sort of the dandelion seed was there, which again is really important, because all the seeds there are loved by finches, and like goldfinches will be down on them eating all the seeds. So they're not much liked plant, but really important, and with a greater emphasis on people not even mowing their lawns now and the like. All these dandelions are up now in people's lawns, and they're all providing a really valuable resource for our wildlife. So if you can leave them, that's great. But as well as a dandelion, there's loads and loads of similar dandelion type flowers. There's hawkbits, hawkweeds, and hawk's tongues. Lots of them seem to have hawk in the title, which makes trying to work out what's what even trickier. But there's probably, as well as your dandelion, which all flower now, maybe even gone over, and generally in your hay meadow by June time, all your dandelions have probably gone over. That's generally then when the slightly later ones appear. So on the left, we have cat's ear, which has sort of a rosette of leaves on the floor, really hairy. And then the stem kind of branches a bit on the way up, and it has these tiny little scales on the stem. You can see a couple of scales on the stem just below the sort of flower head there. It generally has quite a smooth stem. And the other common one is the rough hawkbit. And on that, that's particularly hairy leaves. And then you can see all the way up the stem, all around there, the sepals on the flower is incredibly hairy as well. And whereas the cat's ear quite often divides off the stem into various branches, the rough hawkbit is always just one single stem. And these are sort of, so they replace the early dandelions and carry on providing that vital nectar source throughout the summer. And then we've got a couple of parasitic plants here, which again, people are probably familiar with yellow rattle. It's recommended if you're trying to create a hay meadow, because it's semi-parasitic on grass. So you can see it's got green leaves there, so it can photosynthesize for itself, but also it's a bit greedy. As well as photosynthesize for itself, it taps into grasses and steals a bit of their nutrients as well. But by doing that makes the grass less vigorous, and that allows wildflowers to do even better. So generally there'll be a lot of that in your hay meadow. Occasionally they can get almost too much of it. If you're actually needing to get proper crop from your hay meadow, potentially you could have too much, so can be slightly problematic. But if all you've got your hay meadow is for is conservation purposes, then it's great. And obviously if you want to create a hay meadow and you want to reduce the vigorousness of your grasses, that's one of the first things you should introduce, to try and reduce the vigorousness of grasses and allow all your other wildflowers seed to proliferate. Also called hay rattle, gets its name because there it's in flower, and it'll probably be, I saw one in flower the other day, which is really early, but by late May into June, it'll all be in flower. And then by sort of late June, early July, before the hay cut, all the little, I don't know the botanical word for them, but the bit that's surrounding the bottom of the flower, that'll turn brown, goes crispy, and all the seeds are in there. And if you shake it, it rattles like a rattle. So that's where it gets its name from. And on the right here, we have eyebright and a little bit of salad burnet just sneaking in at the top there as well. But eyebright, another parasitic plant, really beautiful little thing. It's only tiny. It'll only be a few inches tall, but it's well worth getting down on your hands and knees, even if you struggle to get back up again, just to have a look at it. It really is a pretty little thing. And it's called eyebright because it looks like they thought it looked like a little bright eye. Therefore, they thought back in the day, if that looks like a nice, bright, healthy eye, then if there's something wrong with your eye, you should use some of that to make your eye better. I don't know whether it worked in any way, shape, or form, but that's what it was used for, and that's how it still got its name. But there's actually about 20 different species of eyebright, but they're all incredibly similar, very difficult to tell apart. I think only a real expert can do. So if you want to know what species of eyebright you've got, you need to take, I think, a sample of 5 of them and then send them off to one of the UK experts, and then they'll tell you what species of eyebright you've got. I just generally say it's an eyebright and just enjoy that it's a pretty little flower. And as well, with all the other plants in your hay meadow, you'll have sort of umbellifers, sort of so-called because they look like an umbrella. So on the right here, you've got hogweed. Some people don't like hogweed much, but at least it's not giant hogweed, which can give you the nasty phytophotodermatitis. But you have to be careful with hogweed as well, because it's not as bad as a giant hogweed, but that can also give you phytophotodermatitis. But you shouldn't really have any reason to be cutting it or yanking it out of your grassland, because it's particularly loved by loads of insects. You see the massive flowers there on top, and it's a native species, unlike the giant hogweed. So it's generally very welcome unless there's tons of it in your hay meadow. And then on the left, we have a pignut, which is altogether smaller than your hogweed, tiny, delicate little thing. And that is just about to come into its peak now. So it's one of our plants. It's equally at home in woodlands as it is in our grasslands. But you can have some grasslands back this time of year turning white with just thousands and thousands of pignut plants. And that's called pignut because under the ground, it grows up from a little bulb, a little nut-like bulb. It tastes like a nut. And pigs used to like snuffling them up and eating them. And I think children used to collect them as well and eat them. And every year I say, I'm going to try a pignut. But then I look at the beautiful flower and I can't bring myself to dig up even one of them to try it. And unless it's on your own land, it's illegal to dig up any wild flower. So as I work for the Wildlife Trust, I particularly have to obey the law. But one day I might own a field all of my own with some pignut in, and I'm going to dig one up and have a feast. And then the real classic plant of our hay meadows is knapweed. There we go. Just admit somebody. They've missed all the best bits. The real classic plant of our hay meadows, generally the one after lots of our other plants in the hay meadow have gone over, then the knapweed sort of comes into flower, and that really provides a lot of the late season nectar. And then when it goes to seed, again, birds like goldfinch absolutely love it. So on the right here, you have the common knapweed, and then on the left, you have greater knapweed, which is altogether rarer, and you'll only find in sort of, if we have like a calcareous hay meadow, so there's not a great deal of that in Gwent. It has quite different shaped leaves, and the scales underneath the flower are green, whereas the scales underneath the common knapweed are kind of brown, black. And the greater knapweed has these fancy looking rays hanging down, but sometimes our common knapweed can also have the rays, so you can't rely on that. I'm going to have a drink of water. Here we go. We have this is St. John's wort. So we have quite a lot of different St. John's wort species, but there's generally the two common ones you'll have in your hay meadow are perforate and imperforate St. John's wort. So as the name would imply, one of them's got perforations. So if you get a leaf and you hold it up to the sun, but don't look into the sun, but just hold it up to the light, you can see lots of translucent dots in it, so it looks as if it's perforated. If you do that with the imperforate St. John's wort, then there won't be any of these translucent dots, and there might just be a very small amount. So you can't rely on that, but the most reliable thing is to feel the stem. So on the perforate St. John's wort, it's generally a round stem, just with two little ridges on it. But the imperforate St. John's wort is sort of winged and almost square. But there is a square stemmed St. John's wort to confuse things. That's generally in sort of wetter habitats. But as I said, there's lots of different St. John's wort species. So to really be sure, there's lots of other things you can look at. So it's whether it's sort of covered in hair, whether it's downy. And as you can see on the petals there's lots of black dots. So the perforate and imperforate both have black dots on the petals, but there's other St. John's wort species that don't have black dots. And also on the leaves, there's black dots, but not all St. John's wort species have black dots. So if you really want to learn your St. John's wort, you've got to feel the stem, look if it's hairy or not, look if the leaves have translucent dots in them, look if there's black dots on the flowers, and look if there's black dots on the leaves. There we go. So lots to think about if you want to master them. You've probably seen St. John's wort is used in quite a lot of herbal medicine and used in sort of treatments for depression and the like. So if you've got a field full of St. John's wort, then you may have happy animals in there because they're all nibbling on St. John's wort. Sort of low down in your hay meadow, you may well have tormentil. So this is the main picture here is tormentil. It's again, you gardeners probably familiar with potentillas. They're generally sort of bigger plants in the garden, maybe even shrubs, but generally our wild potentillas are quite small, sprawling plants. But the tormentil has smallest flowers, generally low growing, very jaggedy leaves, and only has 4 petals to the flower. There's also a trailing tormentil, which may have 4 or 5 petals to the flower. It's generally slightly bigger flower. And then in the top left here, there's creeping cinquefoil, which, as its name would imply, it has very different leaves, which are generally think 5 lobes. Also, there's always 5 petals in creeping cinquefoil, 4 petals here in the tormentil. But annoyingly, they can all hybridize with each other as well and create all sorts of confusing things. But generally, if it's really small, dainty with 4 petals, it's tormentil, and quite a bit bigger with 5 petals will be your creeping cinquefoil. And then just to finish off, sort of looking at the different flowers in your hay meadow, can't ignore the orchids. So these do look quite dissimilar here, but it's a common spotted orchid on the left-hand side and heath spotted orchid on the right-hand side. And they do look quite different there, but they can look quite similar and hybridized. But generally, common spotted orchid is you can see at the bottom of the flower, there's lots of different bits to an orchid flower. There's wings and hoods and lips. So the bottom part of the flower has 3 lips, and the central lip at the middle of the bottom of the flower in common spotted orchid is quite long. And then in heath spotted orchid on the right hand side, hopefully you can see that lip is a really tiny little point. But also generally, heath spotted orchid generally seems to be a bit whiter, and the common spotted orchid is generally a bit more purpley pink, but you can't rely on that. And generally the heath spotted orchid looks it's not very technical, but it looks more blousy. So if you sort of get all those features, and then you can get quite a reliable identification. But again, they do hybridize. So probably if you found one and you looked at all the different features and you still couldn't work out which one it was, it may well just be a hybrid, but still very pretty nevertheless. And then I think I mentioned earlier, green winged orchids. If you go to our New Grove Meadows Reserve or up to Pen Twin at the moment, they're absolutely coated with green winged orchids. Probably, they were certainly at about their peak a week ago, so I'd imagine they're probably still at about their peak. They're very early this year because we've had an early, mild, sort of late winter, spring, so everything's come on early. So if you want to see them, I would get there quite soon. But if you go back to there in June time, there'd probably be no sign that there was ever a green winged orchid there. But at the moment, they look great, and there's a few white ones and a few pink ones mixed in at the moment. And then if you get more to the field edges, you'll find the early purple orchids. So that's the one on the right. But you can see on the green winged orchid, you can see at the side of the hood, which is the bit at the top of the orchid flower, sort of hanging over the top as a hood would. You can see the kind of green stripes on it. So whatever colour your green winged orchid is, it'll always have these green stripes on the hood, which you can see on the early purple orchid. There's no green stripes at all. But when I was at New Grove the other day, there's quite a few early purple around the edge, thousands of green winged orchids. Common tway blades were just appearing, and there was loads of the spotted leaves of the common spotted orchid. There's at another site, and there's common spotted orchids out already. So it's all happening. So here we do have two more orchid species. On the left is the common tway blade, which I said is just starting to appear at New Grove at the moment. But it's called tway blade because it's not shown in the photograph, but it has two big blades, two big leaves. It just has two leaves down near the base of it, and then this green spike coming up. And then on the right is greater butterfly orchid, which is one of our rarer sort of orchid species. But we have, I think there's a single spike at New Grove, and there's probably a few hundred spikes now up at Pen Twin, and they're generally at their peak probably early to mid-June. So if you want to see the greater butterfly orchids, they're up there. We also have a lesser butterfly orchid in Gwent, but that's only at one site and may not even be hanging on. But the way to tell the two of them apart is they have the pollen hangs down in something called a pollinia, and I can't remember which way around it is, but one of them, the two pollinia go straight down, and the other one, they go away from each other. They're divergent. That's the way to tell them apart. But all the ones up at Pen Twin, if you go and look at them, they're all the greater butterfly orchid. And if anyone does find a lesser butterfly orchid in Gwent, we would love to know about it, because they may well be on the verge of extinction here, sadly. Right, that is the end of all the sort of flower ID. If anyone's got any questions on any of that, then please stick it in the chat. Not the easiest thing to do over Zoom, but thankfully this year we are putting on proper outdoor events where we'll be going through this where the plants are actually in front of us. So, if people want to come along to them, that would be great. But just a little bit to sort of near the end, how to manage a hay meadow. So it's sort of a bit sort of counterintuitive. Generally, in your garden, if you want all your wildflowers to do well, you probably put a bit of fertilizer on, help them to really grow. But if you do that in a hay meadow in a wildflower grassland, your grass will do really well and it'll swamp your wildflowers. So really no fertilizers. You don't want to increase the soil fertility. And then I'll sort of go through how it should be managed throughout the year. But every hay meadow is different, and I've been to some, and I like say this is how you do it, and they'll say, well, we do it a bit different to that, and their field looks amazing. So if you're doing whatever you're doing, if it's looking amazing, you keep on doing it, I guess. But generally, sort of ideally, everything being equal. Oh, is there an easy ID book leaflet for meadow flowers and grasses? There's some really good books, but they have an awful lot of stuff in. But there's there's the Field Studies Council, is that right? They do sort of little fold out laminated pamphlets for about, they're only about £4, and they do various ones for various different habitats, like a woodland one. There's one for like meadows, grasslands, and they generally have all your sort of commonest species on. So rather than lugging around a big field guide, particularly if you maybe just learning, it's worth getting one of these little £4 fold out guides. They can just easily slip into your bag or whatever, and then pull them out, and they'll probably have everything you're likely to see on there. And if there's something you can't see, that's when you go home and maybe look on the internet or look in a better book. But there are some, I hate to say it because I could end up unemployed one day, but there's some fantastic apps on phones now for ID. So I had some students out from the University of Gloucestershire at New Grove Meadows the week before last, and they were sort of trialing apps as part of what we were doing, and it was incredible sort of how well they worked. To be honest, I photographed just the leaf of some rough hawkbit, and it's just a boring green leaf, and it instantly came back with it. And then there was the spotted leaves of an early purple orchid, and there was the spotted leaf of a common spotted orchid there. And I thought, this won't be able to tell apart these two just spotted orchid leaves, but it was absolutely bang on the money. So it's worth trying these apps, and the more they're used, the more people input into them, the more accurate they're going to get. But just occasionally, it throws up absolute rubbish. So you kind of have to. There was some greater butterfly orchid leaves the other day, which I thought I'll trial it out on them in a woodland, and it got it exactly right. Oh, someone else is just entering. And then I tried them out on another greater butterfly orchid in the same woodland, and it told me it was a lady orchid, which doesn't occur in Gwent at all. So in theory, somebody could have done that. The app told them that. They'd have recorded that record, and there'd be these sort of errors coming in. So it's kind of, they're really good to try and help you get to the right place, but I suppose you need a bit of local knowledge about, what part of the country you're in, what time of year it is, all that kind of stuff, just to avoid making errors. But they can be really good as well, just to get you to the right page in a book. So it might say this is this or this, and then you can go into your field guide and then try and find the details. Now, the one I'm asking what app that was. The one I was using is called Obs Identify, but there are specific plant ones which I haven't used, which may be even better, because the one I use, it can be used, for moths and hoverflies and bees and all sorts. It's does a bit of everything. So there probably is just a better one just for plants. But I'm a bit nervous of them, so I don't want to lose my job just to a phone that can do it instead of me. But the thing with the phones, it can't tell you the abundances, and it can't tell you about what the plant's doing, what condition it's in, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully there'll still be ecologists needed to do this work, but it's certainly a useful extra tool to have. And there's another question there. Sorry, I skipped ahead one there. What's the best way to introduce yellow rattle into a meadow? I can't get it to grow from seed. Oh, well, I've managed to get it to grow in my lawn, and I'm an absolutely awful gardener. Maybe I've been lucky, but yellow rattle, obviously, we actually provide some, and so do Monmouthshire Meadows Group, if you were interested, which we harvest from our reserves, which means it's nice and local. But it needs vernalisation to germinate. Yellow rattle does. So that means it'll drop to the floor in July. And what yellow rattle doesn't want to do is instantly germinate, because it's an annual, germinate, not have a chance to flower, and then die. So it needs vernalisation, which means it needs to be frozen over winter for it to then flower. So that means it doesn't flower straight away. There'll be a cold spell over the winter, that vernalises it, and then it'll grow the next year. So it may be possible that you sowed the yellow rattle seed and it never got to be vernalized. So if you had the seed in your house and you sowed it in the spring, it wouldn't have been outside over the winter, so it wouldn't have had that cold spell to trigger it. So that may be it. And you want to make sure that the seed actually gets to touch the soil. So if you just chucked it on your grass, it may not actually get to touch the soil. So when I sowed it on my lawn, I just ran a rake over it a bit just to expose a bit of bare soil. And if you're doing that in a bigger field, you may pull a chain harrow over. You don't want to turn over the soil, but you just want to create that little bit of bare soil for the yellow rattle to get in contact with the soil. So yeah, you want to acquire it, sow it in the autumn, allow it to get cold over the winter, and then hopefully it will come up the next spring. And then the trick is to make sure you never cut it too early, because it's an annual. So if you did happen to cut it in June before it set seed, you could eliminate it entirely. So hopefully that was helpful. Yeah, it is possible, as you say, there may not have been a cold enough winter, because last winter there really wasn't many cold days. So hopefully the yellow rattle will be doing okay. I have seen a lot which has just coming up in the fields now. But any tips for how to encourage wildflowers in previously grazed pasture and to stop yarrow ducks and buttercups taking over? Yeah, so generally if pasture has been grazed a lot, there's certain species do well, such as yarrow ducks, buttercups. Quite often things like some of the nicer ones like cat's ear and knapweed will have survived the grazing as well. But it probably is, obviously take the grazing off, the grazed pasture, and then if you've got an awful lot of ducks, you may need to sort of spot treat them or go round and cut them before they set seed. But I would advise against digging out a duck, because then you just expose more soil for more ducks to get in, really. So it's not good to really dig over any grasslands. That lets all the ducks and thistles in. So really, to sort of keep the yarrow ducks and buttercups taken over, I would probably put in a bit of wildflower seed and take the hay cut, but maybe go round and maybe sort of cut the ducks before they set seed. Or you can get like a spot treat with a herbicide. Obviously, it's ideal not to use a herbicide. But if it has been a previously quite heavily grazed pasture, it may take quite a few years for things to get back balanced and the buttercup numbers to go down and the yarrow numbers to go down. But the yarrow, given a chance to flower, the insects love the yarrow, and it is quite attractive. In fact, I've seen yarrow for sale in garden centres for about £10 or something, and it's just a common thing in most people's lawns. And there we go. Hopefully that was a bit useful. So go back to the calendar for looking after your meadow. So January, February, you may have some light grazing on any sort of new growth, and only if the land's not too wet. Obviously, your land can be very wet in January, February, and if you put lots of livestock on there, particularly big, heavy cattle or horses, you can all get poached and all just turn into a sea of mud. Then sort of early March, maybe a bit later, depending where you are, you probably take your grazing animals off, particularly when it gets mild, and then there's a light harrow if necessary. And then from April to mid-July, this is your crucial period, your fields are sort of shut up. So there's no grazing to allow growth for the hay production. Obviously, you can have wildflowers in a field that's grazed all year round, just really low intensity sort of pasture. But obviously, we're talking about hay meadows tonight. So for a hay meadow, you would shut it up, all grazing gone until about mid-July. And then sort of mid-July, mid-August, that's when you would take your cut. So you take your cut, get your hay off there. Obviously, if you've got horses or other livestock, you've got your farm, you'd be using your hay on your farm. Then if you're taking your cut after they've sort of seeded, but then this is something we've been discussing quite a lot recently. It's quite a devastation cutting a hay meadow. There's like one day it's tall grass, lots of wildflowers, full of flowers, full of all insects, full of all sorts. And then all of a sudden overnight, well, not quite overnight, you don't cut your hay overnight, but during the day, it's all gone kind of thing. So maybe ideally you leave a 2 meter strip around the edge so some later flowering plants can be there providing late season nectar. And you can have the uncut areas, vary them from year to year, because if you always didn't cut that area, it would become rank. And then maybe take a later cut some years as well, sort of maybe on a 5-year rotational basis, because things like the knapweed, and if you have like devil's bit scabious, they probably don't get a chance to flower and set seed by the time you'd normally take a hay cut. So a later one every few years allows those perennials to get their seeds back in. So it's all a bit of trial and error, I suppose, a little bit, but really cutting everything right up to the hedge all in one go in mid-July can be a bit devastating. Someone's asked when would be a good idea to harrow. So you could give it a bit of a harrow in the autumn, particularly if you were maybe sowing seed then, or you could have a harrow sort of early spring, just to sort of freshen it all up before the new growth. Come on. And then sort of mid-August to mid-September, you allow the fields to rest, perhaps allow a second flush of flowering from later flowering plants. And then quite a crucial thing is you don't have to get aftermath grazing in. You can have a perfectly good hay meadow if you just take a cut, take it all away. But if you can imagine, if you cut in mid-July, particularly if you have a mild autumn, you can have quite a lot of grass growth by sort of the end of the season, sort of end of autumn. So ideally, you'd have some aftermath grazing come in, and that helps just to keep down like the coarser grasses. Does a little bit of light trampling, creates sort of pockets of bare soil for seed germination, and any seeds that have fallen, they just lightly press them into the ground kind of thing. So they're kind of doing your job for you. So if you did go out and sow wild seed, if you then got a bit of livestock in afterwards, just to press the seeds in for you, it kind of does the job for you. But again, if it was really wet, then I'd maybe take the grazing off if possible, if there's somewhere else for it to go, just to avoid the field getting too poached. Now then, so obviously we're not all lucky enough to have a hay meadow. So how to create your own hay meadow. So first thing is, we quite often get phone calls of people who want to create wildflower meadows, but generally I say, whenever you've acquired your field, to sort of wait until the next spring, summer, to make sure there's not lots of stuff there in the first place, because you can be surprising what can look like a fairly barren field with nothing in, can all of a sudden, either if the grazing's relaxed or just difference between winter and summer, can be absolutely full of wildflowers. So generally leave it till the sort of summer, see what's actually there, and you may find you don't need to do anything. It's full of great stuff, just for that little change of management. But the soils, if there isn't lots of stuff there, then obviously something needs to be done to create this sort of wildflower hay meadow. So as I said before, the soils need to be nutrient poor. So if you were adding fertilizers, you need to stop, and then you need to take grass cuts and remove the arisings. We acquired Wisewood Common about 12 or 13 years ago now, which is up by Pen Twin. And that was an intensive dairy farm. And for about the first 6 or 7 years, we had 2 or 3 cuts. Farmer was taking cuts away for silage, until eventually they said, oh, this isn't worth our while anymore, because we'd be no fertilizer going in. We'd reduce the nutrients to get, and that's when we put the wildflower seed on. So depending on how nutrient rich your ground is, you may need to do a bit of that, reduce the nutrients, then get your wildflowers on. So I said, when nutrient levels are low enough, then you get your wildflower seeds on. Another question there, right there with me. What would you do if you didn't have any animals? So quite a lot of people don't have their own animals, but you may find a neighbouring farm, maybe if you contacted them, they may be happy to have a bit of extra grazing for over the winter. So, you know, you contact them and they may be happy to put their sheep or a few of their cattle on over the winter. Obviously, then when you do that, then it might be very wet and you might want them off, and you may have to struggle getting the farmer to take them back off again. But if you don't have any animals, you can still have a fantastic sort of hay meadow, even without the aftermath graze. And that's kind of the ideal scenario. But if you don't, you could even take a second cut in October if it was getting quite high, and just remove that, and that'd be effectively what the grazing would be doing. So if you haven't got the animals, or you can't get someone else to put their animals on, then you can take this second cut. There we go. Move that out of the way. So as I said before, you need to make sure there's bare soil for the seeds to germinate on. If you just throw them on top of the grass, they'll just sit there. They won't reach the soil, they won't germinate, and maybe the birds will come down and feast. So possibly a chain harrow. And then you need to ensure that the seed is native and local provenance. There's probably not as bad as it used to be, but there's lots of stuff out there on the market that says it's wildflower mix, and it's not. I was at someone's house last year and they had a bag of wildflower mix, and I'd never even heard of half the stuff it said on the packet, kind of thing. So I urge them maybe just to use that in their garden and do the bit they want it to be a proper sort of wildflower meadow. You know, get some different stuff. So again, you want it to be native, because that's going to do the best here, and it's not going to introduce any problematic things into the countryside. And obviously, if it's local provenance as well, it's going to do best because it's most adapted to our conditions. And if you're looking at your seed mix, then you probably want to know the pH of your soil and how damp your soil is, because there's certain species that do really well in acidic soils, neutral soils, calcareous soils, and sort of damper sites. So there's all different mixes available for different pHs and different dampnesses. So you can probably assess the dampness of your site quite easy yourself, but you may need to do a sort of a pH test. Most grasslands sort of in Gwent will be broadly neutral, maybe bordering on acidic when you get more into the hills, but there are some calcareous areas that are down in the south of Gwent. As I said before, putting yellow rattle into the mix helps greatly, because that just keeps the grass levels down. And generally you want to sow your seed in the autumn, because that's basically, if you can replicate what nature does, that's your best chance of success. And then once you've done all of that and your seeds are coming up, your wildflowers are flowering, and then obviously manage appropriately in the future. So so you're asking about rolling. So I would say rolling the field. I'm not such an expert in all this. Someone's asking if Harran's okay, what about rolling? Generally, I'd probably maybe steer clear of rolling, because that's more likely to sort of probably compact your soil. You don't really want to compact your soil so much. And rolling can be useful maybe if you've got bracken encroaching at certain times of years. You can roll your bracken, a good way to control that if that's coming in from the edges. And then, come on. And then, so now we're going to have a quick look at which hay meadows you can visit. So I said some of them are looking good at the moment, but really June into early July was when they're absolutely at their peak. So Gwent, as I said, there's only 3% left of what was left sort of pre-Second World War, but we're quite privileged here in Gwent because we do have quite a lot of hay meadows relative to other areas, but there still should be a lot more. Lots of these sort of quite small fragments and private sites, but Gwent Wildlife Trust have some great sites which are open to the public. And I said June's probably the best time to visit. So there's Springdale Farm near Usk, which is big. So that's well worth a visit. You could spend all day wandering around the hay meadows there. And I think that's where we're going to hold our grasses, sedges, rushes ID course. There's Pentwyn Farm at Penalt, which are fantastic old hay meadows. There's New Grove Meadows just south of Trellick, and there's Wet Meadows in Trellick. So there's four great sites there, and certainly Pentwyn and Newgrove are worth visiting now for the cowslips and green-winged orchids, and they're worth going back to again in June for all the rest. And then all the others are well worth a visit in June time. And then, come on. As I was saying, we've got various guided walks, which are all welcome to book yourself onto. So Monday the 6th of June, as I said, is grasses, rudges and sedges. I've got Wet Meadow there. I shouldn't have Wet Meadow there. We did that at Wet Meadow last time. It's at Springdale Farm, it is. But if you did go to book that, it'll obviously tell you that on the website. And then the next day, we've got Meadow Plant ID for beginners at Pentwyn. Then a week after that, we've got Meadow Plant ID for intermediates, also at Pentwyn. We don't then have Meadow Plant ID for experts, because it would frighten me trying to do that course. So probably both those would be a great time of year to see the greater butterfly orchid, as well as loads of other stuff at Pentwyn. And then on Tuesday, the 5th of July, we're going to have some, again, plant ID at our Bridewell Reserve down on the levels, which isn't actually open to the public yet, but hopefully will be quite soon. But I know some of you here tonight are volunteers with us. So if you are a volunteer with the trust, but that event's just open to our volunteers as a bit of a thank you. And that's also kindly sponsored by the Wildflower Society, who've sponsored this evening as well. So that's great. And then there's also Monmouthshire Meadows Group, who have 2 open days. So I said some of the great sites are actually on private sites, but some Monmouthshire Meadow Group's members have kindly opened their sites to the public. So they're sites that ordinarily you would never get the chance to visit. So obviously that's well worth going along to. And they're on Sunday the 19th of June and Saturday the 2nd of July. So there'll be various experts in Monmouthshire Meadows Group and myself there to lead various guided walks around these sites. So they're well worth a visit, because you may never get the chance again to see these lovely sites. And again, I should say one more time, big thank you to the Wildflower Society, an organisation well worth joining, and they funded this evening. So thank you to them. There we go. That's finished. I don't know what time it is. Let me see. Have I finished far too early? No, I haven't, you know. I'm 2 minutes late. I do apologise, everybody. Just a couple more questions here. I persuaded Monmouthshire County Council to leave a village green as a meadow, but they did not have a machine to take the foliage away in the autumn, so this unfortunately failed. That is a shame. It's probably better to be left and then cut all year round, but yeah, obviously say if the foliage isn't taken away, it just mulches down on and just makes the wildflowers not do so well. So perhaps you could try Monmouthshire County Council again. You may have more luck, or if you can drop me an email letting me know the site, and I could maybe have a word with relevant people there to see if anything could be done. So I would like to think, you know, as we're all getting more aware of the value of these sites, that they may actually get some cut and collect machinery to actually take it away, because yeah, it's one thing just leaving it and allowing the wildflowers, but if you don't take it away, ultimately the site will get a bit spoiled. And there we go. And then there's a variety of people saying thank you to me, so I shall say thank you back to all of you for coming along, because it would be a bit lonely just sat here in my kitchen just talking to my laptop. So oh, a shout out for Monmouthshire Rewilding Facebook group. There we go. How could I forget them? So yes, as well as Gwent Wildlife Trust, we have our Gwent Wildlife Trust spotting page. So if you've got anything that needs IDing, if you go onto Gwent Wildlife Spotting, you can put anything up on there and we can ID things for you. And then there's also Monmouthshire Rewilding Group, which is a collection of like-minded individuals who have land ranging from just a little bit of lawn to lots of fields, and they're all for just creating more biodiversity, more wildlife in Gwent. So please join their group as well. And someone's going to see me at Springdale. There we go. Great stuff. Righty-ho. Well, I shall say thank you very much to you all for coming along, and have a lovely rest of the evening. And hopefully see you at some of our events in person. So we've done lots of Zooms over the last 2 years, and I'm running out of things to say to a laptop. So I'd much rather get out there in the field, in the sun, and do it all in person. So hopefully see some of you soon. Thank you very much. Cheerio, bye.